Flight 567, Gate C-14, Denver International Airport. The boarding announcement had barely finished echoing through the terminal when Margaret Holloway, a 54-year-old real estate attorney from Scottsdale, Arizona, adjusted her oversized Chanel sunglasses and exhaled with the kind of impatience that only comes from someone who has never once been told no. She was wearing white linen, carrying a monogrammed carry-on that cost more than most people's rent, and she was already annoyed. Her upgrade to first class had been mishandled, her word, and now she was seated in row 4, a business class seat she considered beneath her. She had told the gate agent. Twice. The gate agent had smiled. Twice. Nothing changed. What Margaret did not notice, because Margaret rarely noticed things that did not directly concern Margaret, was the man being assisted down the jet bridge in a manual wheelchair. His name was Daniel Okafor, at least that is what the boarding pass said. He was 61 years old, quiet, wearing a plain navy blue jacket, no logos, no jewelry except a simple silver watch. His left leg was in a compression brace. He had a worn paperback novel tucked under his arm. Something literary, dog-eared. The flight attendant guiding him was named Rosa, a 15-year veteran with United, and she had a gift for reading people. She looked at Daniel and saw someone who had learned to move through the world with minimum friction. She looked at Margaret and saw something else entirely. Daniel was seated in 3A window seat, first row of business class. Margaret was in 4C aisle. The moment Daniel's wheelchair was folded and stowed, and the moment Daniel settled himself carefully into his seat with the quiet dignity of a man who had done difficult things in difficult circumstances and never made a production of it, Margaret leaned forward and said, loudly enough for 2 rows to hear, "They really will seat anyone in business class these days." Nobody responded. The cabin went slightly, perceptibly quiet in that way cabins do when something has just happened that everyone heard and no one wants to acknowledge. Daniel opened his book. Rosa, standing 3 feet away, held her expression perfectly neutral, because Rosa was a professional, but her jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. The flight was headed to Reagan National, Washington, D.C., 2 hours and 40 minutes. Margaret ordered a Bloody Mary before the doors had even closed. She ordered a second one during taxi. She was on her phone, talking at full volume about a closing that had gone sideways, using the word unacceptable 4 times in 3 minutes. The man in 4A put in earbuds. The woman in 3C shifted toward the window. Daniel read his book. Here is what none of them knew. What Margaret absolutely did not know. What the other passengers could not have known. What even Rosa did not know because it was not her job to know it. Daniel Okafor was not just a quiet man in a wheelchair going to Washington. He was, as of 11 weeks ago, the Secretary of Transportation of the United States. Senate confirmed, 91-7. He had flown commercial intentionally, the way he always had, the way he insisted on doing despite his staff's protests, because he believed that the people who made decisions about airports, runways, jet bridges, and accessibility ramps should experience airports the way actual people experience them. He did not fly with an entourage. He carried his own book. He did not announce himself. His chief of staff, a 34-year-old named Patricia Nwosu, was already in D.C. waiting. She had texted him 6 times since boarding began. He had not replied yet. He was reading. This was a man who had testified before Congress, who had been interviewed on 4 Sunday shows in the past month, whose photograph had been on the front page of the Washington Post twice since his confirmation. And right now he was reading a novel in 3A while Margaret Holloway ordered her 3rd drink and loudly told someone on the phone that she deserved better than this. The flight attendant, not Rosa, a younger one named Caleb, brought Margaret her Cabernet Sauvignon. Full glass. Then the plane hit its first patch of turbulence. Not violent, just enough. Just enough that a full glass of red wine, held carelessly by a woman mid-monologue, tipped forward and poured, entirely, completely, spectacularly, over the left shoulder, the neck, and the open book of the Secretary of Transportation of the United States. The cabin did not go quiet this time. The cabin went into a very specific kind of frozen stillness where everyone is watching but performing not watching. Daniel slowly closed his wine-soaked book. He set it on the tray table. He looked down at his jacket. He looked up. Margaret was already talking, not apologizing, talking, saying something about turbulence, about the airline, about how her dry cleaning bill was going to be outrageous, and wasn't this exactly what she meant about the state of commercial aviation? Daniel said nothing. He reached for a napkin. Rosa appeared from nowhere with club soda and a stack of towels with the efficiency of someone who had seen worse and handled it better. But her eyes went to Daniel's face for just a moment, and what she saw there was not anger. It was something much more controlled than anger. It was the expression of a man deciding something. 37 minutes into the flight, Margaret Holloway had still not said the word sorry. She had said, "These things happen." She had said, "I hope it comes out." She had said, with genuine bewilderment, "I don't understand why you're being so quiet about it." She had not said sorry. Daniel noticed. Rosa noticed. Caleb noticed. The man in 4A, despite his earbuds, had one of them out. What Daniel did, which is the part that will matter later, was this. He pulled out his personal phone, not the government-issued one, his own, and he sent a text to Patricia. It said simply, "Still on flight. Have something to share when I land. Accessibility audit." Then he put the phone away and asked Rosa, very quietly, if she had another napkin. Rosa brought him 3. This is the part of the story where you need to understand who Daniel Okafor actually was before he became Secretary of Transportation, because it explains everything about why he reacted the way he did and why what came next hit the way it hit. Daniel had not grown up flying in business class. He had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a Nigerian immigrant father who drove a city bus for 22 years and a mother who worked the night shift at a postal distribution center. He had taken his first flight at age 19 on a Spirit Airlines ticket he bought with 3 months of saved wages. He had lost the use of full mobility in his left leg in a traffic accident caused by a poorly maintained federal highway in 2019. An accident that became, quietly and personally, the reason he had accepted the nomination for his current position. He did not talk about the accident in interviews. He did not use it. It was his, Margaret, who had now shifted into a sort of performative chattiness with the passenger across the aisle. A retired teacher named Gary, who was trying very hard to read his Kindle and keep smiling, said something that landed like a stone in still water. She said, gesturing vaguely toward the jet bridge area and then toward Daniel without looking at him, "You know what this country's problem is? We've made everything so accommodating that nobody has standards anymore. I mean, no offense, but I remember when flying was elegant." Gary put down his Kindle. Rosa, who was walking past with an empty tray, stopped walking. Daniel turned a page. The woman in 3C, who had been pretending to sleep for 40 minutes, opened her eyes. Margaret continued, "I'm not saying anything about anyone specifically. I'm just saying, standards. That's all. Standards." The cabin, and this is the only way to describe it, held its breath. Daniel did not turn around. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anything. He simply said, clearly enough to be heard but calmly enough to carry no aggression, "You poured a full glass of wine on me 20 minutes ago and you haven't apologized. I think the standards conversation might need to start somewhere closer to home." It was 11 words. 12 if you count the contraction as 2. The effect was surgical. Margaret's face did something complicated. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She said, the turbulence," and then stopped, because even Margaret, in that moment, could feel the weight of the cabin on her. Gary was looking at her. Rosa was looking at her. The woman in 3C was fully awake and no longer pretending otherwise. Even Caleb at the front galley had gone still. What Margaret did not do was apologize. What she did was pivot into offense, because that is what people like Margaret do when the defense collapses. She said, voice rising slightly, "I don't know who you think you are, but I paid for this seat and I don't need a lecture from." And she stopped herself, but the pause was 1 second too long, the kind of pause that tells you exactly what word was considered and rejected. Daniel looked at her then, fully, unhurried. The look of a man who has sat in Senate confirmation hearings for 9 hours and been asked questions designed to rattle him and has answered every single one without losing composure. He said, "Finish the sentence." She didn't. Rosa stepped forward, and this was the moment that Rosa, 15-year veteran, made a professional calculation. She said, gently but with the authority of someone on her aircraft, "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice, please. Then she turned to Daniel and said, equally gently, Sir, can I get you anything? And in the way she asked it, the slight extra weight on the word sir, the steadiness of her eye contact, she communicated. I see you. I am sorry. I don't know yet what I'm dealing with, but I see you. Daniel said, just some water, thank you. He turned back to the front. The ruined book was still on the tray table. His jacket was still stained. He looked out the window at 34,000 feet of open sky, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket's inside pocket and removed a small leather notebook, an old one, the kind with a strap and a brass clasp, and he began to write. He wrote for the next 40 minutes without stopping. Nobody knew what he was writing. Not Rosa, not Gary, not the woman in 3C whose name was Susan and who was, it turned out, a retired federal judge who had spent 20 years on the bench and had a very specific facial expression she used when she was watching someone make a serious mistake in her courtroom. She was using it now. On Margaret. Margaret could not see it. But Susan could see Daniel. And Susan was the kind of woman who noticed things. Reagan National Airport. Gate 22. The flight had landed 14 minutes early. The jet bridge was extended. Passengers were standing, pulling bags from overhead bins, doing the standard deplaning shuffle. Margaret was already on her feet, already on her phone, already narrating the flight to whoever was on the other end. An absolute nightmare, truly. I don't even want to talk about it. Already moving toward the front of the cabin. What she saw when she reached the jet bridge door stopped her feet. There were 4 people waiting at the end of the jet bridge. Not airline staff. 3 of them were in dark suits. One was a woman in her 30s in a tailored blazer, holding a secure government phone in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. And she was not waiting for just anyone. Her name was Patricia Nwosu, and when she saw Daniel Okafor emerge from the aircraft door, jacket stained, book ruined, moving carefully with his brace, her expression shifted through 3 emotions in less than 2 seconds. Relief, concern, and then something that looked very much like very controlled fury. Patricia said, Sir. Then she looked at his jacket. Then she said, quieter, What happened? Daniel said, I'll tell you on the way. Is the afternoon briefing moved? Pushed to 5. I moved it when you didn't text back. Good. Margaret, who had been standing 3 feet behind Daniel in the jet bridge, heard this exchange. She looked at the suits. She looked at Patricia's badge, which was visible, a government ID on a lanyard, and the seal on it was not ambiguous. She looked at the security detail. She looked at Daniel. She looked back at the badge. Her face, by several accounts later, went the specific color of someone who has just made an irreversible error and knows it. Behind her, Susan, the retired federal judge from 3C, stepped off the aircraft. She saw the security detail. She saw Patricia. She looked at Daniel. And she did what she had been trained by 3 decades of legal life to do. She assessed, calculated, and said nothing. But she stayed. She did not move toward the terminal. She stood at the edge of the jet bridge near the door and she watched. Rosa came off last after all passengers as procedure required. She came around the corner of the jet bridge and stopped. Saw the detail. Looked at Daniel. And then, this is the part Rosa described later to her colleague, and then, weeks afterward, in an interview she never intended to give, she understood. Not who he was specifically, not his title, not his name, but the shape of it. The weight of what had happened on that flight rearranged itself in her understanding into something much larger than a rude passenger and a spilled drink. One of the agents stepped forward to Margaret. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, simply and professionally, and said, Ma'am, we're going to need a few minutes of your time. He showed a credential. Margaret looked at it. She looked at Daniel again. He was already walking down the jet bridge toward the terminal with Patricia at his side, talking in low tones, not looking back. Margaret said, I don't, who is he? The agent said, Secretary Okafor, Secretary of Transportation. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. For very long seconds in which Margaret Holloway stood in a jet bridge at Reagan National with a wine glasses ghost on someone else's jacket haunting the room and the weight of 11 words she had not said. I'm sorry, Just 3 words. She hadn't even managed 3 words. Pressing down on her from all directions at once. Susan, from the doorway, watched. She had the expression of someone watching a verdict land. Daniel did not look back. This was deliberate and it was noticed. He did not perform the revelation. He did not turn around for the moment. He had somewhere to be. He was the Secretary of Transportation and he had a 5 o'clock briefing and a ruined jacket and a notebook full of observations about this country's jet bridges and wheelchair access ramps, and the way flight attendants are undertrained and undersupported when passengers choose cruelty as their mode of travel. But Patricia looked back. Once. Briefly. And Margaret. And then forward again, because there was work to do. 3 days later. Margaret Holloway's name was not in the news. This is important. Daniel Okafor did not call a press conference. He did not tweet. He did not mention Margaret by name to any journalist, any colleague, or any member of his staff other than Patricia, and Patricia mentioned it to exactly no one. This is the part of the story that reveals everything about the character of the man, and it is the part that most people, when they hear it, go quiet. What Daniel did was this. He submitted, through proper internal channels, a 14-page accessibility audit of Flight 567 and Denver International Airport's jet bridge infrastructure. He noted, specifically, that the wheelchair assistance provided by Rosa, full name Rosa Elena Figueroa, 15 years of service, commendation record, was exemplary, and he recommended she be formally recognized. He noted that the jet bridge at Gate C-14 in Denver had a 3-inch lip that created unnecessary difficulty for wheelchair users and recommended remediation within 90 days. He noted that the airline's cabin crew training on de-escalation during passenger conflict was insufficient and requested a meeting with the airline's VP of Operations, which he received within the week. None of this was public. None of this was performance. Rosa Figueroa received a formal commendation from the Department of Transportation 6 weeks later. She found out through a letter delivered to the airline's HR department. She read it twice standing in the break room, then folded it very carefully and put it in her bag and did not tell anyone for 3 days because she was not sure it was real. Gary, the retired teacher who had been trying to read his Kindle, went home to Albuquerque and told his wife about the flight. He told the story at dinner. He did not know who Daniel was. He did not find out until 2 weeks later when he saw a news segment about accessibility infrastructure and recognized the voice before he recognized the face. He called his wife into the room. He said, "That's him. The man on the plane." His wife watched for a moment. She said, "What happened?" Gary told her. His wife said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He didn't say anything?" Gary said, "Not to make it about himself. Not once." His wife nodded slowly. She said, "That's either very strong or very sad." Gary thought about it. He said, "Both, I think." Susan, the retired federal judge, wrote a piece. Not for a newspaper. For her personal blog, which had approximately 200 readers, mostly former clerks and law school colleagues. She did not use anyone's name. She wrote about what it means to witness a moment in which power and dignity operate without announcement. She wrote about the specific texture of restraint, the choice not to weaponize what you have. She wrote, "The most powerful thing I saw on that flight was a man choosing silence not from weakness but from such a surplus of strength that retaliation would have been beneath him." She wrote it in 4 paragraphs. She posted it on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, it had been shared 40,000 times. By the following Monday, it had been read by a White House press correspondent who tracked it back to its source and called Susan, who declined to comment further and stood by every word. Patricia Nwosu, who had worked in government for 11 years across 3 departments and 2 administrations and had seen every shape of power used and misused, told exactly one person about the jacket. Her mother. Over the phone the evening after the flight. She described Daniel coming off the plane. Stained jacket, worn book, walking carefully, no complaint, and 4 agents meeting him at the jet bridge and a woman behind him whose face collapsed when she understood. Patricia's mother listened. At the end, she said, "He didn't say anything to her?" Patricia said, "He said what he needed to say on the plane. 12 words. Then he was done." Her mother was quiet. Then she said, "That's a man who knows who he is." Patricia said, "Yes, ma'am." They talked about other things after that. Margaret Holloway flew home to Scottsdale 4 days later. She sat in 6B, middle seat, no upgrade available. The flight was full. She sat between a college student listening to music and an older man who fell asleep before taxi and snored gently for 2 hours. She had a sparkling water. She did not talk on her phone. She looked out the window for most of the flight, across the aisle, past the shoulder of the student, at the flat desert below. At one point, somewhere over New Mexico, she opened her bag and took out a notepad. She wrote something. Then she put the notepad away. Nobody saw what she wrote. Nobody asked. The last thing Daniel Okafor did before leaving Reagan National that day, and this came from his security detail, not from him and not as a story he ever told, was stop at the accessible restroom on the arrivals level. Note that the door mechanism required 17 pounds of force to open, which exceeded federal ADA recommendations by 6 pounds, and photograph it with his personal phone. Then he texted the photo to Patricia with a 3-word message, "Add to audit." Then he went to work.